Good after, Good afternoon. This is Elliot from Fineman, CEO of National Gun Victims Action Council. Fumbling for my glasses, but I've got them. I had my reading glasses on, not the distance glasses. At any rate, you're listening to It's the Guns, Stupid, and we have, as always, a very exciting show. I do want to point out that we are the one place where we don't pull any punches. We talk about things the way they should be talked about. Uh, and we take on the hard questions and give the hard answers. And apparently, so hard with our answers that many of the pro gunners that want to come and be on our show have ducked invitations because they know they're not going to get away with any of their uh, well, I'm on the air, so I'll say it politely, but with any of their ill-chosen and random facts that come from nowhere. Uh, but at any rate, I do have one special announcement. We have so much going on. One of them things is we're going to be developing a new format to come back with in the fall. Uh, the key reason being that uh, we originally had structured the show to have someone on our side and someone on the pro gun side, but the pro gun people appeared on the first five or six or seven shows and then started not appearing. So even one said that dared me to come down to someplace in Indiana to talk at an NRA meeting there, and I said I would if they'd come on the show, and we never heard from them again. So that said, we will be having very exciting stuff coming up in the fall, a bit of a new format. We're focused now on our Hallmark boycott and on our Operation Sideline, which I'll be talking about later in the show. But what I'd like to do is maintain one of our old format structures here, and that is Martha Rosenberg, our senior editor, and I will talk about some of the news items going on right now, or this last week or two. Martha, what do you got?
Well, hi there, Elliot. Nice to be with you. Our big news here in Chicago, which is really of national significance too, is that a suburb called Niles has approved a pistol range and gun shop 350 yards from a school for emotionally disturbed kids and very close also to the high school of that suburb. And this has been going on most of the summer with so many of us saying, what are you thinking? And yet the Illinois State Rifle Association pushing it through, and it was approved last night.
Well, I've been part of watching what's been going on, and I know that various community groups local to Niles and Evanston, which is right next door, as well as some of the national groups have been working on trying to get this stopped. Uh, the proposition is so absurd that it's almost like you're in a time warp zone as we talk about it. I think I have the map in front of me, and as I see it now, I do need my reading glasses. Okay. As I see it, the gun shop and range is literally across the street from the New Hope Academy, which is a therapeutic day school for youth with emotional challenges. It's right across the street from a daycare or party and play facility center for children ages 2 to 12. It's right adjacent to a sports complex for volleyball for serving children's grades 1 to 8. Right near gymnastic classes for children and near the Nile Central High School. and near the Orchard Academy, which serves children with cognitive, emotional, and learning disabilities between the ages of 17 and 22. What more reasonable place to put a gun shop? It's just it's just defies belief. We've talked a bit about it, a lot about it actually, with the principals that were opposing it. What did you hear are the reasons that uh, the this went through?
Well, certainly this is a legal tactic of the gun lobby. And for those listeners we have who don't know Illinois or Chicago, we've had two rulings not too long ago that came out of the same agenda, which is to arm cities and arm places that aren't the gun proliferation. And one of them, of course, legalized concealed carry in Illinois, and the other uh, made it legal to have gun shops within the city of Chicago, as if we don't have enough bloodshed. So the ISRA working, which is the Illinois version of NRA, is pushing this, is behind it, and that's I think how this happened. And in their publicity information, they are so derisive against moms, and a lot of the local moms said, "What are you thinking?" And ISRA made fun of them, and they said in one press release, "Mom's apple cart upset." And they're trying to refer to local people who don't want these lethal weapons near their children as a New York gun control group, when this is really the local population. But anyway, this was driven by the Illinois State Rifle Association, which packs town meetings. It reaches its zenith when these things happen, and many of us who are against gun violence are not able to combat this kind of opposition because we're not single issue people the way they are, and people will come in from hundreds of miles to pack these town meetings.
Well, I think we're getting better at having good representation. I know we had good representation at this one because I interacted at great length with Denise Stonebeck, who was one of the leaders, on our side. She's the chair and founder of a group called People for a Safe Society. So I know we had turnout on our side. It seemed to be a foregone decision prior to even hearing number one that this was going to go through. It went through, I think, by a vote of 4-1. 4 council people were for it, and 1 was against. But uh, what I heard, and Martha, maybe you have more intel on this than I do. What I heard was that one motivating factor for the council was the uh, increased tax revenues that they thought that they project they're going to get from this gun facility, and another is that this is a standard tactic, isn't it?
Well, yes, it is. And I think it is about money, as you just said, but I think that another agenda that we're not hearing as much about is the idea of lawsuits, because both the mayor and a trustee said this is our way of protecting taxpayers against long, drawn-out court battles from the NRA, which will lose, and then because they've seen these other 2 court cases here in Illinois that NRA succeeded with, and I think that it's the threat of the court battles that helped to drive this through.
In other words, the idea being that if you don't do what we want, we'll bankrupt you in court.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of a real strong arm tactic that the NRA has successfully used, and now the Illinois version is using it all around the country to get their dream. And their dream is that everybody should be carrying a gun at all times, everywhere they go. That's their holy grail. One of the things that really disturbed me about this, not that everything disturbed me about it, I think it's nuts. I think it's nuts. And I think that, I would love to see laws passed where the board has liability for anything that goes wrong. It's very easy for them to pass a vote, but if somebody breaks into the gun store uh, and gets the guns and starts shooting up the neighborhood and kids and people, I wish the law was that they would be responsible. They'd be accomplices to that act. But one of the things that's unbelievably disturbing is the person who's going to manage this shop. Um, could you say something about that, Martha? I know you called it to my attention, and I know that you're very concerned about it, as am I.
Well, the manager is going to be a man named Michael Darga, Darga, and his credentials for this post of managing this pistol range and gun shop near the high school and near the daycare centers is that he managed a gun shop called Shore Galleries for the last 20 years. Shore Galleries made the local news several times because that gun shop, along with three other ones, are responsible for 20,000 criminal guns in Chicago. And so,
Wow.
yeah, it's a dirty, a dirty shop that has. Well, many people have heard about Chuck's gun shop, which many of our illegal guns in Chicago come from there. But Shore Galleries is right up there with Chuck's and two others in producing crime guns, which means mostly that they're more interested in sales than public safety.
Well, of course we know that. Of course we know that. But imagine that that's the person, somebody who is associated with a facility that has been identified as one of the top providers of crime guns. And these crime guns, of course, are illegal. And then if you get the pro gunners saying, oh, look at Chicago, it has all these tough laws, and look at the gun crime. And I always say because of trafficking, and this is a form of trafficking,
Right.
uh, when the gun stores provide the guns illegally to the people who then sell them on the streets, uh, I always say we have as many guns. We have no gun laws. We have as many guns on the street as we'd have if we had no gun laws at all.
Because of
And
trafficking.
yeah, well, because of the trafficking. Yes, Martha, what were you going to say?
No, I'm agreeing with you, Elliot. That it's the weakest link, and it doesn't matter what laws Chicago has if the neighboring county or state, or in this case, Shore Galleries, which is where this Michael Darga worked, have loose, policies. Then it doesn't matter what laws are in place. And
Well,
the
you
the
essentially
thing,
negate the laws.
right? And the other thing that is so disturbing about this is that it hasn't been that long since this Newtown massacre, and I think all of us were so aware of the problem of mentally ill people, getting a hold of a gun, and the problem of children being subject to that. And this is exactly what they're creating again, scenarios like that.
Yes, yes. It it's like so many of the things in these gun wars. It's insane. That's why I always talk about our insane gun laws. This is insane. If you read this in a Dickens novel, you wouldn't believe it. It's absolutely insane. Well, Martha, we have to wrap up the news right now. Uh, I'll see you later after our interview because we want to talk in depth about Hallmark and also Operation Deadline. But thanks so much for making this a big, essentially the whole part of the news we're talking about because this is national. This is a microcosm of what happens all over the country. So
You're
let's take
absolutely
a
right.
break. We'll be right back.
I'm a third grade teacher.
I'm a school bus driver.
I am a parent.
I am a teacher's aide, and I agree to be identified
As a caring adult who pledges to help bullied students.
I will listen carefully to all students who seek my help.
and act on their behalf.
to put an immediate stop to bullying.
I will work with other caring adults to create a safe
Learning environment for all the students in my school.
In my school.
In my school.
in my school.
I'm Dennis Van Rokel, president of the National Education Association. Help us create safe, bully-free learning environments for all students. One caring adult can make all the difference. Be that adult and take the pledge at nea.org/bullyfree. Adults have the power to stop bullying in our schools.
It starts with me.
It starts with me.
It starts with me.
It starts with me.
Bully-free. It starts with me.
Visit NEA.org/bullyfree. A message from the National Education Association.
Packers,
Vikings,
Red State,
Blue State.
We come from different places.
Uptown,
Downtown.
We come to different conclusions.
half empty,
Half full.
But no matter how different we are, we're all connected, and we can all make a difference. That's why United Way brings people, expertise, and resources together to improve the education, income, and health of our communities, the building blocks for a better life. When we live united, our efforts, magnified by others, add up to real change. Children succeed in school, families gain financial stability, the health of our neighbors improves, and suddenly, so do our communities. But real change won't happen without you.
Live united.
So let's look beyond our differences.
Live united.
One by one, let's make a difference. Let's reach out a hand to one and influence the condition of all.
Live united.
Give, advocate, volunteer. Live United. Sign up today at liveunited.org. Brought to you by United Way and the Ad Council.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Well, welcome back to It's the Gun Stupid. I'm Elliot Fineman, your host, CEO of the National Gun Victims Action Council. And we have a very, very special guest with us today, a gentleman named Lee Goodman. Lee is the founder of a very important group here in Illinois called Stop Concealed Carry Coalition, or SCCC as I call it, but it's Stop Concealed Carry Coalition. And Lee, despite the fact that he's the founder and probably the leader, and the leader insists that he is an organizer. So Lee, welcome to our show, and I will address you as Mr. Organizer, if that's okay.
That's wonderful. Thanks very much. Good to be with you.
Good that you're here. And I know, Lee, also that you're an attorney. And I was wondering, and I did some research, but I couldn't find it. So I thought I'd ask you, I was wondering how you got involved in the gun issue.
It probably was nothing any more complicated than paying attention to the news and at some point deciding that whatever talents I might have to lend to this cause were worthwhile.
So it's kind of like that movie Network. You've had enough. You're not going to take it anymore.
Well, I think that there's an awful lot of issues these days that people feel that way about, and this one just happens to have gotten my attention, and I think it's very worthwhile.
You live in a suburb of Chicago, and how long have you been doing this, Lee?
Well, I don't know exactly, but for the last several years, we found that, you mentioned concealed carry. Illinois was the last state in the country that did not allow people to carry concealed weapons. So we formed the coalition that you mentioned to try and keep it that way. And it just so happened that not too long after we formed this coalition, a court held that Illinois would have to allow concealed weapons. So for the last year and a half or so, we've been working on that issue with legislative level and organizing people against concealed weapons. Ultimately, Illinois did adopt a law which allows people to get permits, licenses to carry concealed weapons. So now we're looking not just at how that will be implemented, but also at other issues.
Well, this is a subject and an area very dear to my heart, and one that we've really taken a very powerful stance about. I'm very familiar with Judge Posner's ruling. He was the fellow who wrote the judge who wrote the majority opinion. It was a 2-1, but he used the phrase for one of his rationales was that law-abiding citizens have a right to carry guns for self-defense, and that was part of his opinion. And we have gone on, and we always do, and I'll tell you in a little while about a challenge that we have issued, but we have always said that there's only two things wrong with that statement. What's a law-abiding citizen? Because it's certainly not a constant. A person could be law-abiding today and not tomorrow. So the pro-gunners want us to put our faith in the fact that somebody was law-abiding and will always stay that way. But that's, if you think about it rationally, every criminal was once a law-abiding citizen. But the other part is that to defend yourself, and our position is that carrying concealed does not offer any protection because the element of surprise always defeats the gun carrier. If carrying, kept you safe, no police officers would ever be killed. So we feel real strongly about that, and we're engaged in trying to do a test. Actually, we challenged the Illinois State Rifle Association. We said we'd put up $50,000, and instead of arguing, let's do a test and find out. They've never responded, but a big gun blog has, and we're just looking for a place to do it. So thoughts about that, Lee?
Well, the other phrase you'll hear is responsible gun owners. And the number of gun shootings and killings and misuse has gotten to the level that I no longer believe there is such a thing as a responsible gun owner in this country. The very act of owning a firearm is an irresponsible act because you are contributing by your ownership of a gun to the hazard that has gotten to be totally unacceptable.
Well, I think, if you wanted to use, I have an engineering, background, not a legal one. So I think in terms of numbers, I think one could demonstrate that a certain percentage of the population are responsible. The problem is they're not constantly responsible. They're not like the NRA tries to divide the world into two types, law-abiding or responsible gun owners and criminals. And they imply, that law-abiding, responsible people will always be that way, and criminals will always be criminals. And when I ask them to tell me what does tell me what a responsible gun owner is or a law-abiding citizen, their silence, and then finally they, will say, well, it's somebody who follows the law. And I'll say all the time. And then there's more silence. So there may be some responsible, gun owners. I'm sure there are, but why do I want to bet my life and my family's life that the ones I'm meeting are?
We in this country, unfortunately, have a history of violence that dates back well beyond, that is before the founding of this country. The Second Amendment that we will hear referred to in virtually all these debates was just one milestone to affirm our belief in violent resolution of disputes. That's why I am now taking the position through an organization called Peaceful Communities that what we need to do is to repeal the Second Amendment. We need to erase that part of our collective belief system that says violence is the way to resolve problems. So we are now working for the repeal of the Second Amendment. Once we do that, and we will have a chance at improving the situations we live in until we repeal that Second Amendment, so long as we have a statement in our very Constitution that guarantees people the right to have guns, there's very little likelihood we're going to make any progress.
Well, it's an ambitious project. What are some of the things you're doing, to move in that direction? And, what are some of the predictions, if you will, or the obstacles or the things favoring getting the outcome you want?
We're doing the same thing that has been done every other time that any significant change has been made in this country, including all of the other prior amendments to the Constitution. That is, we're appealing to the people. I'm talking to you, and hopefully some people out there are going to be listening and talking about this when they do. And it's really a matter of raising consciousness as the very first step. It's going to take some time. It took a long time before we got around to amending the Constitution so that African Americans could vote. It took a long time before we amended the Constitution so that women could vote. So it will probably take a little bit of time before we get around to actually repealing the Second Amendment, but we've made the start, and that's very important.
Are there any other organizations around the country that you're partnering with or that are doing the same thing?
I'm not aware of any other than Peaceful Communities. It's not to say they're not there, and we'll expect to find them later. But what we find is most of the groups who have been working against gun violence have taken a much more conservative approach. And you'll routinely hear people who are asking for different kinds of gun control measures to start out their dialogue by saying, I am not trying to interfere with the rights of gun owners. Well, we are trying to interfere with the rights of gun owners because we don't believe there should be any right to own guns. Other countries have gotten rid of any right that there might have been to own guns, and they've been able, therefore, to enact the kind of gun control measures we've been unable to, and they have very much reduced the level of gun violence in a way that we've not been able to.
And I might add that they've sacrificed virtually nothing. They still have hunting. I'm thinking of England, but any of the other countries, France, Italy, they have hunting. Anybody who wants to hunt can hunt. They have marksmanship contests or marksmanship, going to the range to develop your skill. They have gun collectors, but what they don't have are the gun homicides and the gun violence that we have.
Exactly, because they look at the ownership and possession of guns as something which is not a right, but is something which is more like a privilege, and therefore it is much easier to regulate, and they therefore can be much more selective on who has guns, what kinds of guns, and under what circumstances they use them.
One of our, the person who heads our social media action, is doing a piece. It'll be ready for publication pretty shortly, contrasting the requirements for getting a gun here with England, and making the point that obtaining a gun, where here you can do it in 24 hours, or you can do it, on the internet. But if you get it through a gun shop, it's a 24-hour wait. Otherwise, I think I've seen statistics that 2 out of every 5 guns sold are sold without a background check. But if you go through the background check, it's a 24-hour deal that they have to give you a yes or no. And if they're missing information and they can't get it, they have to give you the gun. Oh, and then they destroy the record that you do have the gun. Her position, and I thought it was very well said, is that the background check for getting a gun should be as extensive as it is for adopting a child. And that is that the person should be people who know the person applying for the adoption, for example. What they do is they interview everybody who is in their world. Plus, they do background, about whether they're criminals, what kind of character they have, how stable things are. They take every precaution to make sure to protect this one child that's going to be adopted. And in England, that's how they do it as well for guns. In England, you can't get a gun. By the way, I'm sure you know there are no handguns allowed in England. That was their response to their Sandy Hook when the massacre at the school took place in Dublin in 1996. Their response was to ban handguns. So the only gun you can get is a rifle, and it shoots 3 bullets, 1 in the chamber and 2, ready to go in after you've shot the first one. No semi-automatics, etc. And to get this, you've got to get a reference. People have to write references saying that, Lee is a stable guy, and we know him and we think he'd be okay with the gun. And then they go and interview everyone in your world who knows you, friends, neighbors, family, school teachers, etc., etc. And after that, they interview you. They interview physicians. And after you go through all of that, then you can get a gun. And that takes about 2 months. What do you think? I'd like to see that being one of the things we work for.
There are any number of measures which come under the general category of common sense regulations, which we could adopt, which many other places have, each of which would make some part of the difference that we need to see. But we've been failing to adopt these things for the last several decades. As a matter of fact, the situation has gotten worse. Concealed carry, for instance. A couple of decades ago, there was hardly any place in the United States you were allowed to carry a concealed weapon. Now, almost everywhere you can carry a concealed weapon. I don't think anyone can reasonably say we're in better shape now than we were a couple of decades ago with regard to the violence that we're seeing in our country. So, yes, there's many, many things that we could do that we should be doing unless we think that the violence is okay. And unfortunately, I think what we're seeing is a large part of this country wants additional regulations, but a large part of the Congress and of the legislatures of the various states thinks that the violence is acceptable, and they think that it's okay that little children and adults are being murdered every day with guns. I don't think that's acceptable.
Well, I completely agree, and I've heard the pro-gun extremists, which polls tell us are 25% of the NRA, but I've heard them say that's the price of liberty.
It's hard to imagine that that's the price that we have to pay, because it's not always been that way in this country. It's not been that way, and it isn't that way in the rest of the world. It's delusional to think that we have to continue to live in the state of horror and terror that people live in this country, particularly in certain neighborhoods, and that there's no alternative.
It absolutely is horrific. And what's also equally bewildering, if you will, is that the countries, other countries with, similar cultures, have figured out a way to not have to have this. This is not an automatic thing. I've heard them say, if it weren't for guns, we'd have no liberties. It's only the guns that give us the freedoms we have. And the Second Amendment, which you're trying to appeal, and I wish you every success with it. And if there's anything I can do to help, please let me know. But what they say is that the ability to have any of our freedoms depends on the Second Amendment. And my response always is, oh, my God, You mean if we didn't have the Second Amendment, we'd have to live in shackles as indentured servants as they do in England? We'd have to live like they live in France or in Italy or Norway, etc. I mean, it's so absurd. It really is. It really is crazy making.
It's the equivalent of saying that if we allow women to vote, we will no longer be free. And that really essentially was the argument that was made before we decided to allow women to vote. Or if we allow black people to vote, then we will not have a free country. And I mention those things because there's a very clear tie between the Second Amendment and that kind of racist thinking that led to slavery in this country. The Second Amendment was largely put in place in order to preserve slavery in this country. So I think those other arguments having been proved invalid goes a long ways toward showing the invalidity of the argument that we also need guns to be free.
What would be the 2 or 3 things that you'd like to see happen tomorrow? I know repealing the Second Amendment would be one.
Well, I think that I would like people to realize that we can't wave magic wands, and that this kind of change is something that's going to have to take place because of people becoming politically involved. And I say politically in the very broad terms. And that's what our constitutional structure is based on, the idea of we the people having the power to run our government. And sadly, people have lost that feeling. They no longer believe to a great extent that we the people can get the laws that we want, particularly in the area of gun control. They feel that the NRA is too strong. They feel that the Congress and the legislatures of the states are unresponsive. So waving the magic wand, I would first eliminate the thought that what we have to do to make change is to wave magic wands. I would like people to realize we have always had the power to make this change. We still have it, and all we have to do is set our minds to it, and it'll be happening.
Well, it's an optimistic view. I'm unbelievably troubled that we know for sure, because polls taken in 2013 and a recent poll taken about a few weeks ago by Quinnipiac College shows that 90%, over 90% of the country wants uniform background checks, universal background checks, rather, a background check on every gun sold. And we can't get that passed. So the people have spoken. You know, the people's will is known, and the question is, how do you get it passed? And I know it's not a magic wand. I was just curious about your wish list. But the people have spoken. You know, it's no different. Nobody wanted to go to Iraq. I mean, you know, the great majority of the people didn't want to, go to war over there. And yet the government does it. How do we rein in? I'm kind of drifting a bit here, but I do have a purpose that comes back to guns. But, you know, how do we get the government to do what the majority wants?
And your point is completely correct as far as I'm concerned. There have been other periods in our country, however, where we've had the similar difficulty, where we've had do-nothing Congresses, where we've had courts that have misinterpreted the Constitution, just as our Supreme Court has misinterpreted the Second Amendment and put us in the situation we're in now. And it doesn't always go exactly right all the time. But ultimately, I believe that this is still a governmental structure, a democracy, a representative republic, however you want to call it, which can and will represent the will of the people. So I don't think we can get discouraged, allow ourselves to be discouraged by the fact that we're not getting the result that we should be getting immediately. Ultimately, I think we will.
Well, I sure, like that optimism, and I, would like to, feel that we would. I think a lot of things have to change, but, one way to get the change going is to start talking about it as we are. So tell me a little bit more about the Second Amendment. What's the name of that group?
If you go to peacefulcommunities.org.
Peaceful Communities, yeah.
Right. Then you'll find a little bit of information, and basically we're taking a grassroots approach, doing the sort of things that have always been done of organizing, talking in various forums and churches and community groups, letters to the editor, conversations with representatives. All of those sorts of things is the sort of thing that we've started and that we'll be continuing to do. And certainly we welcome your support, and everyone else's support along those lines, because this kind of change can't be just a matter of what I think should be done. It has to be a matter of what do people think should be done. Most people who've been involved in these issues have really not given serious thought to repealing the Second Amendment. As much work has been done on various proposals for guns, most people start out assuming that the Second Amendment has to be there. And what I'm trying to do is get people to stop and realize that if we were writing the Constitution today, that 90% of the people who want certain measures, I believe, would not say we need to include the Second Amendment. It simply would not exist if people thought about it. It's not something that reflects today's reality.
Well, I completely agree with you. And on prior shows, we've talked about the work of Professor, and I always get his name incorrectly, the fellow who wrote The Hidden History of the Second Amendment, who makes clear what you just said. The only reason we have the Second Amendment was to enable slavery. That's why we have it.
It's a very complex history. It's very difficult to tease out, in part because there's so little documentation which led up to the Second Amendment. It wasn't one of those things that was hotly debated in the debates about whether or not to have a constitution or what amendments should be there. Basically, it sort of popped up out of nowhere, and it got thrown in and passed at a time when the Constitution was very young, and the Congress had a lot of other things to be worrying about. So there isn't a whole lot of the documentation that tells us exactly where it came from. We have to look to the history and the conditions, and when we look to that, we see that really what was happening was you had a division between the slave-holding states and those which were against slavery, and those who wanted slavery in order to continue their lifestyle, their life of privilege at the expense of other people. They forced their way through on a political compromise. It wasn't anything that probably was ever given much thought at the time, but even if it was, the question is, do we have to be saddled with something that 225 years later doesn't fit our times? And I don't believe that we do.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And one of the things I always talk about if I am in a debate or giving a talk is that there are a couple of words that seem to be missing in the Second Amendment. I don't see the word firearm or gun or self-defense. I do see the word arms. And I've always wanted to see what would happen if we were able to get ultimately the Supreme Court to define what an arm is. I've always wanted to go and try to buy ricin, which of course you can't, right? And then I would say, well, you're denying me my Second Amendment right, because the UN has a category of arms, and I think there's like 34 or 36 things that are defined as arms, and chemical weapons, are one. And I'd like to get all the way up to the Supreme Court, even this Supreme Court, though I don't know. I don't know what you can count on with these people.
You're very brave if you want to go in front of the Supreme Court on any issue of the sort.
Yes, it's a real crapshoot, that's for sure. But what is an arm? That's what it says. And as far as the slavery went, the militias had been used, I went back and did some digging, and in the slave states, typically somewhere between 35 to 40% of the population were slaves. And there was a peculiar thing. They didn't like being slaves. So they would rebel, they would run away, they would, just try to change their condition. And the militias were used to keep them in place. And the threat of, as my understanding of it, the threat of forming a country which would have an army that could conceivably abolish or control the state militias was so big that they had to put in the Second Amendment in order to get that ninth state, Virginia, to say, okay, we'll ratify the Constitution. But yeah, it shows, how perverted good thoughts might be, and how perverted bad thoughts can be made. It seems to be there's no end to this.
And interestingly, that you mentioned the Supreme Court decisions, which of course just very, very recently said that the Second Amendment had anything at all to do with self-defense of the person. Up until just a few years ago, everyone understood that the Second Amendment meant the right to bear arms in the context of a militia, which of course was supposed to exist for the preservation of the public entity, of the state, of the peace of the people, as opposed to individual defense. So what we have is a very peculiar reading of the Constitution, which was, I think, very deliberately put in place for political purposes. If you take a look at the decisions of this court, particularly in regard to guns, and you put them into the context of the political influence that's reaching this court, and if you talk to the gun owners of today, as I do, if you spend some time listening to the rhetoric that's coming out of the NRA, you realize that what we have here is a very, it's an angry attitude. People who are frustrated and angry at the way their world has turned out have decided that the way they're going to face the world is with violence, and what's more violent than a gun? So sadly, whatever our history may have been with regard to slavery and the Second Amendment, what we're seeing today is an attitude of anger and violence, which is expressing itself as public policy, and that is ultimately destructive of the very notion of civilization.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I think, to me, the word anger has always meant fear. I've always argued that you can't be angry unless you're afraid. But putting that distinction aside for a moment, so many of these gun owners are absolutely afraid of Martha Rosenberg, who was on the show earlier and will be on the show after our interview, always writes about, she's our senior editor, she always writes about why is it that grown men weighing 250 pounds are afraid to go where children and old ladies go unarmed. Why? What's going on here?
What's going on, I think, is that there are many challenges facing people. There are a lot of people whose lives simply have not turned out the way they had hoped they would. And sadly, there are people who are willing to seize upon that and take advantage of it and use that disappointment, anger, and, as you say, fear in order to build a political coalition that will shape our country in a certain way. And the gun industry is just right in there amidst all of that.
It's bad stuff for sure. And I think it's important for people like yourself. I've read some of the interviews you've given, and saw one of your commentaries on a video show you were on video on a show you were on, to just challenge the status quo, to not let the words, what's happened, and this is what so offended me about the Illinois decision. The words have become acceptable. Law-abiding citizens have a right to carry guns for self-defense. Well, it kind of sounds right if you don't know about it. Just like I'm sure it sounded right that the earth was flat. Look out. You can see it's flat. If it was round, people would fall off. So simplistic logic, if you will, can really take you down a wrong path. But the idea that we have laws being driven by things that are absolutely known not to be true, and I mentioned earlier we have a challenge out, and we're just trying to find a place to do the test where we're going to take conceal and carriers, and I think you'd be pretty interested in maybe getting involved in this a bit with us. We want to get a street scene and a building scene, kind of like a Hollywood set, or maybe it's just a real street and building. And we want to have three types of conceal and carriers come walking down that street. One being the people who never had any training, because in many states you can conceal and carry without having any training at all. Two, people who have had the 8 hours, or Illinois is going to require 16 hours of training, maybe recently, maybe a year ago or whatever. And three, the hotshots who go to the gun range every day and live, sleep, and die with their guns. And what we propose is let them each be walking down the street and an assailant show up, and let's see if they can defend themselves. Seems pretty doesn't seem like brain surgery to do that kind of test. Let's see them being in a building, in an office, and see if they can defend themselves. The element of surprise will just defeat the gun carrier. And I think once we can prove that, that's why I'm so enthused about doing this experiment, this test, if you will. Once we prove that, I think then we could circle back, now you're a lawyer, maybe you could comment on this. Assuming we could prove that proposition is false, that carrying a gun provides self-defense, and it was incontrovertible that that was just a false proposition. Couldn't we go back to the legislators and undo the law, saying it was based on wrong information?
Well, you can always go back to the legislature for these changes, and I would hope that the legislature at some point will reconsider at least parts of what has led to this. For instance, the Illinois law right now says that someone who has a permit to carry a concealed weapon can pretty much carry it wherever they want, except for some designated places. They can even carry it into your home unless you tell them not to or post a sign, or into your place of business. Well, there are people who are saying that's backwards. What it really ought to be is they cannot carry it into your home or your place of business unless you tell them ahead of time that they can. So there are people who are working for that change, which I think just makes sense. It's just hard to imagine anyone thinks that it shouldn't be that way. But they passed the law the wrong way, and there's some good hope and some good thinking that the legislature in Illinois will make that change initially, and I think that would be one good start. But I would say, as interesting as your study is, I hope that also someone will give consideration to, even if the people were able to demonstrate that they could defend themselves, there's the additional question of what additional danger are they creating to all those people who live in that street that you're talking about? Because the bullets don't stop a couple of feet away from where they're fired, and people on a regular basis are getting shot in their homes by stray bullets. So I think that as interesting as your study is, at least it should be footnoted that the whole question is not just can someone defend themselves, but what are they doing as far as creating an additional risk for everyone else around them.
Well, I'm glad you made that point, because the studies done, New York City, for example, did an 11-year study as to how accurate their police officers were in a gunfight. And they found that they missed 7 out of 10 shots. Those 7 bullets went flying. In fact, I think at the end of 2012, there was an incident at the Empire State Building where they were chasing a criminal, a perpetrator, I guess, and 7 people got shot that were all civilians, that were all shot by the police, by police guns. So you're absolutely right. I don't want somebody pulling out a gun to defend a situation.
And unfortunately, the gun owners who talk about their rights to self-defense or defend their families, I never hear them talking about this additional question of what are they doing as far as everyone else. It's a very selfish attitude that they're the only people in the world who we need to be concerned about. And I don't think that that's what this country was built on. The idea is we the people, and we always have to be considering everyone else in the society.
I agree. I totally agree. And it's as clear as day that it is selfish, it's non-caring, it ignores the reality of what the guns have done. 30,000 lives a year lost each and every year. And that's not a price I'm willing to pay. None of us are willing to pay. So we'd like to make this happen sooner than later. Have you been able to engage any other organizations in different states with your personal peaceful communities initiative?
This initiative really has just recently gotten started, and I'll tell you the reaction I get, and it's interesting to me. When I talk to people who have been involved in the effort to get gun laws, gun safety laws, gun control laws, it's not unusual for them to look me in the eye and laugh when I tell them I want to repeal the Second Amendment, because they've had so many defeats and so many disappointments that they're looking very narrowly at what is realistic, what can be accomplished. But when I come back to them the second time I see them, or the third time, and they really start thinking about it, it's not unusual for them to say, Lee, it's maybe not the area that I'm going to put my attention into, but it makes sense and I wish you luck. But the more interesting reaction is when I ask the average person on the street, and I've been passing petitions, I ask them, what do you think? Virtually everyone will say, I'll sign your petition, I agree with you. They have no hesitation because they're looking at the merits of the issue. And the merits of the issue say to them, we have to do something to reduce guns. And if it means amending the Constitution, there's nothing wrong with that. The Constitution says it can be amended. It's been amended many times. We're supposed to amend it when we need to.
That's the whole point, isn't it? that was one of the gifts of the creators, the founders, that things will go wrong, things will change, and here's a mechanism for adjusting for it. So, boy, I totally support what you're doing, Lee. And this is a funny way to extend an invitation, but I live downtown and you live out in the suburbs. And why don't we try to have dinner one of these days? I'd like to hear much more about this initiative. And I think we're working on some things that you'd be interested in hearing about as well. So I think I have your number. I think Martha sent it to me. Maybe we'll try to do that in the next couple of weeks.
I would love to do that. That's the best invitation I've had in a long time.
Well, thank you. So listen, thanks so much for being on the show, Lee. You have not only a wealth of experience and knowledge, but you have real strength. We're with you. We never say we're not going to take your guns away. That's not our position. And we never say, oh, yes, we have to respect the Second Amendment right, your Second Amendment rights. We say we want to make sure there's public safety here. And whatever that takes, that's what we're for. So thanks for being who you are. Thanks for fighting. And I look forward to hooking up with you and spending some more time talking about this and other things.
That'll be wonderful. Thank you very much.
Take care, Lee.
Goodbye.
Today might be the day I drop out. If someone had helped me earlier, I might not be struggling. And studies prove that kids who read well by third grade are more likely to graduate. There are tons of ways people like you can help kids like me stay in school. And United Way is calling for you to be one of them. Because it takes 12 years to create a graduate. It takes about the same time to create a dropout. And the difference between me becoming one or the other could be you. Make me a success, not a statistic.
Take the pledge to volunteer now at unitedway.org. Brought to you by United Way and the Ad Council.
Let me tell you who to blame. Blame the boy lying at your feet, his body oozing life through the hole in his stomach where the bullet tore him apart. Blame him for challenging you, for not looking away and for not backing down when you pulled out the gun. Blame your mother for bringing you into this world when she was but a kid herself, and for dragging you up, not bringing you up. Blame society for not giving you hope. Blame your father for not being there, the man who looked after himself instead of looking after you. Blame the gun in your hand for making you a target, for making you more likely to be picked on. Blame the dead boy, blame your mother, blame society, blame your father, blame the gun, blame anyone but yourself for not being strong enough to put down the gun, to break the cycle.
Okay, well, welcome back to It's the Gun Stupid. I'm Elliot Fineman, CEO of National Gun Victims Action, your host. I hope everyone had a chance to hear what Lee Goodman had to say. A very powerful force working for moving us towards a sane relationship with guns and advancing for the first time something that I think is so ahead of the curve that it really excites me, the idea of repealing the Second Amendment. I think people on our side think that that is so remote that you can't even think about it. Kind of like how they used to think about going to the moon. But when we decided to go to the moon, we got there. And who knows? Who knows? But I know one thing: if we don't try to repeal it, it never will be repealed. So I'm excited about it. I'll look forward to having dinner with Lee and talking about this. Well, we have some time now to talk about another subject, very near and dear to us. And that's the Hallmark boycott that we've recently called about a week ago. And I thought I would discuss this with Martha. Martha, are you there?
Yes, I am, Elliot.
Okay. So as maybe there are listeners who don't know, but let me just give you a little background. Because when we say we've called for a boycott of Hallmark, people say, why Hallmark? Hallmark is a good guy. They care about family and community and children. Why would you be boycotting them? And what people don't know, Martha, and they're always pretty shocked, I know you were, when I shared this with you, Hallmark is the only corporate company, the only large corporation, the only corporate entity that has come out and said, we support the NRA's agenda. Now, they didn't use those words. What they said was that we would never oppose any anti-gun regulation. That's their stance. Publicly, no company has ever said such a thing. They've publicly said we would never support any anti-gun regulation. Well, what's an anti-gun regulation? Well, the NRA considers universal background checks anti-gun. So Hallmark would never oppose, the anti-gun regulation. The NRA thinks that any background check is anti-gun. So Hallmark, in order to not oppose it, must support it. In other words, whatever the NRA says they believe in and they want, if you oppose it, you're opposing it. You're supporting an anti-gun regulation, and therefore Hallmark can never oppose anything the NRA proposes. What do you think about that, Martha?
Well, yes. It's a very broad statement that they made. And, even if they hadn't made it, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, but any corporation which says, well, we don't get involved, it is getting involved because the current laws allow people to come in their stores, whether it will be their customers or maybe their employees who are going to be threatened by these handguns. And these corporations, as you've mentioned, Elliot, all stood up against secondhand smoke and smoking. So these are the same corporations. They won't let somebody come in and smoke next to you, but they'll let somebody carry a lethal weapon next to you. So if a corporation won't take a stand, and they said, like Hallmark has said, it's divisive, they are taking a stand because they're assenting to the current situation.
Well, and they also are taking a stand in two other ways. First of all, there's not a single major corporation in this country that allows guns in their corporate headquarters, including, I might add, the NRA. Imagine,
right.
You can't go into NRA headquarters carrying a gun.
And on our Facebook site, one of the gun worshippers said, "Well, maybe that's because they're afraid that their officers might get hurt." And that was not a tongue-in-cheek remark; that was a real remark. As if, hello.
Yes, that's why we're opposed to it. That's the whole point. So the point is, when a corporation takes the position that they are going to ban guns in their corporate headquarters, they're making a statement, and the statement is, we know guns are dangerous. That's what it means. If guns weren't dangerous, they wouldn't ban them. So then what most of the corporations do is they say that, look, we sell a product, we sell a service. If you want to get the laws changed, you change them. That's not our job. And our side has mistakenly, in my view, allowed corporate America to do that. We've allowed them to stand on the side, and we're not going to allow that anymore. That's what our boycott of Hallmark is about. We're going to get Hallmark to come out. We asked them. We wrote them a letter with our partners in this, the Newtown Victims and Clergy for Corporate Responsibility, saying, we just don't get it. We just don't get it. You claim you care about kids and families and children. Here's the number 2 killer of children. Here's the number 2 killer of children, and you say you have nothing to say other than you're not going to support any anti-gun initiatives. How could you say that? So we wanted to meet with the president, with the chairman, rather, and the chairman, in 3 conversations, sent the message that we don't get involved in divisive issues. And I said, well, you don't have a choice. We're involving you. You're involved. And I said, so here's your business decision. Forget about guns. This is a business decision. 90% of the country wants universal background checks. So you can be a hero to 90% of the country, or you can turn your back. Guess what they did?
Yeah, it's baffling. It's absolutely baffling. We've seen National Gun Victims Action Council, our group, were the original people to talk to Starbucks about not allowing those carriers into their stores. And we've seen over and over again that companies they're afraid of these belligerent, there are small numbers, but they're very belligerent gun rights activists. But they discover very quickly that 90% of this country does not want them in the stores, does not want them parading around the streets like it's Marshall Dillon, and it is a good business decision. But the corporations who always have pages and pages on their website about corporate integrity and social service won't take a stand on something that, as you said, is the second largest killer of children in the U.S., and they just don't, quote unquote, don't want to get involved.
And I can understand that they don't want to get involved. What I don't understand, and what we now no longer will allow, is we will not allow them to not get involved. And we're going to do whatever it takes with our partners, with our allies, and with the American people to get Hallmark to support universal background checks. That's what we asked them. We said that we want to meet with you and we want you to publicly support universal background checks. You could publicly say that you're not going to support anti-gun initiatives. Now what we want you to say is that you'll publicly support what 90% of the country wants, universal background checks, and you'll also work for them. And their response is, we don't do divisive issues. And I said, well, you know, if you think the American people are going to accept that, I don't. Let's find out. So that's what we're doing. We've launched something called Operation Sideline. Sorry. And Martha, I think you're familiar with what we're doing here.
Well, I think it emanates right out of what we're talking about, which is the idea that corporations cannot remain neutral any longer. That's over with. We've said often that if corporate America wanted no guns in the public places, it would happen tomorrow, just like it did with cigarettes. So they have the power, and I think it's exhorting them to declare that power.
Exactly. We want corporate America off the sidelines, because the moment corporate America gets off the sidelines, we'll get to sane gun laws. Again, Lee Goodwin would be happy to take people's guns away. I wouldn't be happy to. I would be happy to live in a gun-free society, but I give the fact that people have grown up in parts of the country where guns are just part of life. They hunt, they shoot, targets, and so on and so forth. And there's no reason we can't have both. There's no reason we can't have sane gun laws and people can't, who want to, enjoy their guns where they live.
Well, Elliot, as you're talking about this idea of Hallmark not even supporting universal background checks, and I think it's significant what happened about 2 weeks ago in the Houston suburb, where that innocent family was absolutely a victim of the lack of background checks. And I wonder if you might talk about that for a second.
Well, that was what our press release was that we just put out last week, saying that universal background checks could well have meant that the Stay family, that was their name, the Stay family, all of the 5 of the 6 members were murdered, cold-blooded murder, and all of those people could be alive today if we had universal background checks, but Hallmark doesn't support universal background checks. And the reason universal background checks would have mattered was that the killer, the murderer, had an extensive history of domestic violence, of misdemeanors involving violence. He had been, in fact, convicted of a felony for stalking, but he pleaded it down to a misdemeanor, and was able to. We've never gotten really the answer to how did he get his guns. That's always hidden. That's part of the covering up that the NRA affects. But the point is, if we had universal background checks, he well could have been stopped from getting the gun. And these people would be alive. So it's utterly inconceivable that Hallmark is opposed to this. And we're not going to let them, or we're going to make sure that every American knows they should buy products from different card makers. One last thing I'd like to say, because we're coming kind of up to the end of the show here, is that we identified 59 sponsors of the Hallmark channel, and we urge everybody who wants to participate in this to join our Operation Sideline program, which consists of a number of things, but one of them is sending messages on the Facebook pages of these sponsors and on their Twitter pages saying that you find it hard, or you won't support companies that don't support universal background checks. And we really want to continue firing away here. And I just I thought we only had a minute or two left, but that's not the case. We have 15 minutes left. So good, because I'd really wanted to talk more about this. What we have on our website, if you want to, and our website's www.gunvictimsaction.org, www.gunvictimsaction.org. If you go to our website, you'll see a link to something called Operation Sideline. And all you have to do is follow that link, and you'll get all the information you need to participate in getting corporate America off the sidelines. You'll have links to every Facebook page and every Twitter page of all the sponsors and of Hallmark. We suggest that people who really care try to reach out to 3 corporate sponsors a day and make 1 or 2 posts on their Facebook page and 1 or 2 tweets, and then go to the next group of 3 and just keep cycling through, because they need to hear from us. And if that's too hard to do, if that's just too hard to do, my God, I'm have to go on their on Facebook and leave some messages. If that's too hard to do, and if not buying Hallmark cards is too hard to do, too much of an imposition, well, guess what? Then don't bitch about the guns. If that's too hard to do, don't be bitching about what's going on with guns. But I can't imagine when 90% of America wants universal background checks, that 90% of America wouldn't be willing to let these 60 corporations, the 59 sponsors, and Hallmark know that we're not going to stand for this. We're just not going to stand for it.
When they go to our site and they see Operation Sideline, there are some suggested postings they can put on these sponsors' pages, and they're very rational. One of them says, "I will choose to spend my hard-earned money with companies that really care about their customers and the communities they live in. It's time to decide as a corporation if you are okay with over 30,000 lives needlessly lost to guns every year." So the comments that people can put are already on our website, and really, you're talking about maybe a minute a day or 2 minutes a day to let these corporations know, and especially because almost all the corporations today make some kind of semblance of community commitments and integrity, and so they've exposed themselves. They want to be good guys, and they need to hear from people saying, "Okay, it's time for you to get off the sideline."
Absolutely. And to give our listeners a sense of the power of getting one major corporation off the sideline, I look back at what happened with the gay and lesbian marriage effort, the marriage equality. And they fought for years to make this a reality. And they did make incremental progress, but very little and very incremental. In January of 2012, I should say, in January of 2012, Microsoft came out in favor of marriage equality because there was a referendum in the state of Washington where Microsoft is, and they said they support it. They think that this is a right thing to support. It's good for corporate America, and it's just the right thing to do. Within 3 months, Martha, 289 major corporations, companies like Apple, Google, Oracle, General Electric, Procter and Gamble, all came out supporting gay marriage, marriage equality, gay marriage, whatever words you want to use. A year later, in 2013, states were already passing laws allowing it. And now, here, 2 years later, in 2014, if you're opposed to marriage equality, you're really out of the mainstream. Look what happened. Just one corporation coming off the sidelines. And we've gone after Hallmark. We could have gone after any corporation to be the one off the sidelines. But Hallmark, which has stated in essence that they support the NRA's agenda, we're not going to let that stand. We're just not going to let that stand. And if Hallmark doesn't see the error of their thinking and the danger of their thinking, when corporate America when people stand on the sideline, when corporate America stands on the sideline, that enables things like Santa Barbara to happen, things like the Late family, the Stay family, things like the two police officers killed in Las Vegas, things like Aurora, things like Sandy Hook. When corporate America stands on the sidelines, they're not neutral. They're enabling something that they know is dangerous. They know that it's dangerous because they ban the guns in their stores. So
no, you're absolutely right, and it's time to not let them hide it. It's like hiding from a big social issue, and they didn't hide from the gay marriage and other things. So it's time to disallow them that position. And so once again, people can go to gunvictimsaction.org, our website, and they'll see Operation Sideline, and they can't. This will give them the companies who are sponsoring Hallmark, who they can respectfully post their messages with, and this is part of giving corporate America notice.
Exactly, Martha. Exactly. And we've also put links there, so you don't even have to, go on Facebook and chase them down, or go on Twitter and chase them down. There are links directly to their Facebook and their Twitter pages. And if you really, really care about doing something about gun violence, about making our country safe again, if that matters to you, then there's absolutely no reason for you not to participate in this. And if you don't, I'll say it again. I'd say it to your face if we were in contact. If you can't do this, if this is too hard, or you don't want to get around to it, or, it's 3 minutes a day, how can I do that? Then don't do it, but don't bitch about the guns anymore. Don't let us hear you say that, when's this going to end? It's going to end when we, the people, to use Lee's phrase, when we, the people, decide that we are not going to allow corporate America to stand on the sidelines anymore. We're not going to let the NRA dictate things, because big as the NRA is, they're a peanut compared to corporate America. If corporate America says we want universal background checks, we'll have them tomorrow. And if you're not willing to take the steps to force corporate America to do what they need to do, to stop enabling and to become part of the solution, not part of the problem, then go to our website, join Operation Sideline, and I keep saying deadline because in my mind, the deadline's been reached. It's enough. We're not letting corporate America stand on the sidelines anymore. But join Operation Sideline and let corporate America hear from you, and let Hallmark understand that you're not going to be buying their cards anymore until they come out and live, walk the talk. They say they care about families and children. They even say that we're not a company that talks about community and integrity. We live that. That's who we are. That's what we do. Well, I don't think so. I don't think so. Not until you start supporting universal background checks and do something to stop this scourge, this horror that's been unleashed. We've just got to stop it and turn it back. Well, Martha, do you have any closing comments? I know you were working on something interesting. You just well, you're always working on something interesting. But do you have any, any more comments about the Hallmark or Operation Deadline program we've started?
I think that it's important for listeners to know our true numbers compared with the gun lobby, because they are loud and they're belligerent. But I'm going to say about 2005, the NRA tried to launch a boycott against ConocoPhillips, which is an oil and gas company. And it fizzled out within 2 or 3 days because they don't have the numbers. However, around the same time period, H&R Block had formed a partnership with NRA, and so many people like us said, "We will not work with you if you have this kind of liaison." That they dropped NRA. We have the numbers; they don't, and so it really is a question of simply making your voices heard. Through economic leverage, as you've often talked about.
Well, I totally agree with that, and I'm so glad you brought that up, Martha. And let me just give you, since we're talking numbers, let me just give you the numbers. Polls consistently show that over 90% of America, including 75%, 3/4 of the NRA, wants universal background checks. Polls also consistently show that 100 million Americans want sane gun laws, and again, 75% of the NRA wants that too. They don't want people walking around with semi-automatics that shoot 50 bullets a minute. They don't want cop killer bullets being sold. They don't want guns being carried in sensitive places like schools and congressional places, public parks, etc. So we have 100 million, 90% of adults. We have 100 million people that are on our side. The NRA claims to have 4 million members. Well, I'm always skeptical about what they claim, but let's for the moment say they do. And 3/4 of those members are on our side. So that leaves 1/4 or 1 million. So there's 100 million of us and 1 million noisy ones on their side. And I know who's going to win that fight. 100 million is always going to beat 1 million. And what we've got to do is exert our edge, exert our superiority of numbers, and just force the issue. Stop asking for the legislators to do the right thing, but tell them, and if they don't do that, compel them. So while you're on our website, also look for our Tell and Compel pledge, and you'll understand that what that says is that when we call for an economic action, like boycotting Hallmark, you will do it. And if we have enough people signing that pledge, we'll be able to change the laws that way too. So it's the pledge, tell and compel, and it's getting corporate America off the sidelines. Well, we now have officially come to the end of our show. Look for us in the fall. We're going to have a bit of a different format. We'll still have interesting people and interesting topics. And in the meantime, everyone have a great rest of the summer. And don't forget to go to www.gunvictimsaction.org and join Operation Deadline. All the best to everyone.
listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.